The first gunshot rang out just as Zachariah Mills stepped onto the creaking porch of Holloway's General Store, causing every head in Wichita, Kansas, to snap toward the commotion. It was 1873, and trouble had found its way to town once again. Zachariah Zach, to the few who dared call him anything, didn't flinch. At 32, he'd heard enough gunfire to last several lifetimes. The war between the states had taken his youth, and the decades since had hardened whatever remained of his heart. He merely adjusted his worn leather hat, shielding eyes the color of a winter sky from the harsh summer sun, and continued on his way. "Another one bites the dust at the Silver Spur," muttered Ernest Holloway, as Zach entered the store. The shopkeeper's hands trembled slightly as he arranged tins of beans on a shelf. "Sheriff'll have his hands full again. Third shooting this month." Zach nodded once, acknowledging the words without engaging. He placed a short list on the counter: ammunition, coffee, salt, tobacco, essentials for a man who preferred the company of his cattle to people. "Might be nice having a woman's touch out at your place, Zach," Ernest said, not for the first time. "My niece arrives from Boston next week. Educated lady. Makes the finest apple pie east of the Mississippi. Not interested." Zach's voice was rough from disuse, like leather that had dried in the sun too long. "Clara Whitman's been asking after you. Widow 3 years now. No. The Johnsons' eldest daughter. I said no." The words carried the weight of finality. Ernest sighed, gathering Zach's items. "You can't spend the rest of your days alone out there on that ranch. It ain't natural." Zach placed coins on the counter with precision. "Being alone suits me fine." As he loaded his supplies onto his wagon, he felt eyes on him, not an uncommon occurrence in Wichita. He was aware of his reputation. The stoic rancher who'd built a modest cattle empire through sheer determination, who never smiled, who turned away every attempt at friendship or courtship with the same cool indifference. Some called him heartless. Others whispered about his past, fragments of stories about a wife who died in childbirth, or a sweetheart who'd betrayed him during the war. None were true, but Zach preferred the rumors to the reality. The truth was simpler and far more painful. He'd learned early that loving meant losing, and he'd lost enough. The second gunshot came as he was untying his horses from the hitching post. This time, it was followed by shouts and the sound of breaking glass. Zach scanned the street with practiced vigilance, noting the cluster of onlookers outside the Silver Spur saloon. He should have ridden away. That was his pattern: observe, assess, depart. Town troubles weren't his concern, but then he saw her. She burst through the saloon's swinging doors, skirts hitched in one hand, a small valise clutched in the other. Her hair, the rich amber of autumn wheat, had partially escaped its pins, framing a face flushed with either exertion or anger. Perhaps both. Behind her came Darrell Tucker, the saloon owner, his florid face contorted in rage. "You ain't going nowhere, Miss High and Mighty. You signed a contract." The woman whirled to face him. "A contract obtained through lies. I came to play the piano, not to entertain your drunken patrons in other ways." Her voice carried across the dusty street, cultured, with a hint of somewhere far east, but steel ran through it. Tucker grabbed her arm roughly. "You'll do what I tell you, or—" Zach wasn't aware of moving until he was already there, his hand clamping down on Tucker's wrist with enough pressure to make the man yelp. "Let her go." 3 simple words delivered without emotion. Tucker's bloodshot eyes widened in recognition. "Mills. This ain't your business, making it mine." Zach increased the pressure until Tucker released the woman's arm. "She owes me, signed contract for 6 months. I paid her train fare all the way from—" "How much?" Zach cut him off. Tucker blinked. "What? The fare? How much?" $20. But that ain't. Zach released Tucker's wrist, reached into his vest pocket and counted out the sum. He placed it in Tucker's palm, folded the man's fingers over it, and fixed him with a stare that had made braver men step back. Contracts paid. She's free to go. A tense moment passed as Tucker weighed his options, glancing between the money in his hand and Zach's impassive face. Finally, he spat in the dirt. "Fine, take the stuck-up bitch. Ain't worth the trouble." Zach turned to the woman, expecting gratitude. Instead, he found himself pierced by eyes the color of summer sage, blazing with indignation. "I didn't ask for your intervention, sir," she said, chin lifted. "I was handling the situation." "Looked like it," Zach replied dryly, her cheeks colored. "Nevertheless, I don't require a savior. Nor do I appreciate being discussed as if I were property to be purchased." Zach felt a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or amusement. It had been so long since he'd felt much of anything that he couldn't properly identify the sensation. "Where you headed?" he asked, ignoring her protest. She hesitated, glancing down at her valise. I'm not entirely certain. I had planned to secure lodgings once I was established at the saloon. Town's not safe for a woman alone." Zach gestured toward his wagon. "I can take you to the Henderson place." "Martha Henderson takes in boarders sometimes. Respectable widow." Suspicion narrowed her eyes. "And why would you help me, Mr. Mills?" "Zachariah Mills," he shrugged. "Heading that direction anyway." It wasn't true, but something prevented him from turning his back on this woman with fire in her eyes and nowhere to go. She studied him for a long moment, weighing her limited options. Finally, she extended her hand. "Grace Owens, from Philadelphia." Her hand was smaller than he expected, but her grip was firm. Zach released it quickly, uncomfortable with the contact. "Wagon's there," he said, nodding toward the hitching post. "Your choice, Miss Owens." Grace surveyed the growing crowd of onlookers, Tucker's scowling face, and the dusty streets of a town that had already proven less than welcoming. Then she lifted her valise and moved toward Zach's wagon with the dignity of a queen. "I accept your assistance, Mr. Mills," she said. "Though I wish to be clear that this creates no obligation between us." Zach helped her onto the wagon seat, careful to minimize contact. "Wouldn't dream of it." The ride to the Henderson farm stretched 5 miles outside of town. Grace Owens maintained a rigid posture beside him, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Zach kept his eyes on the trail, letting the rhythmic clop of hooves fill the silence. "May I ask what brings you to Kansas, Miss Owens?" he finally asked, more to break the uncomfortable quiet than from actual curiosity. Grace's shoulders stiffened slightly. "Opportunity, Mr. Mills. Philadelphia has become restrictive for a woman of my circumstances." And those circumstances would be a 26-year-old unmarried music teacher with no family connections and limited prospects. Her voice was matter-of-fact. "When I saw the advertisement for a piano player in a growing western town, it seemed a chance for independence. Tucker's saloon ain't the place for independence. So I discovered." Her fingers twisted in her lap. "I was misled about the nature of the establishment and the nature of the accommodations." Zach's jaw tightened. He'd heard about Tucker's accommodations for his female employees, small rooms above the saloon where additional services were expected. "You know much about ranching, Miss Owens?" She looked at him with surprise. "I beg your pardon. Ranching. Cattle. Henderson raises dairy cows. Might hire you to help with the milking." Grace laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "I'm afraid the closest I've come to agriculture is tending window boxes in my boarding house." Zach nodded. "Martha might need help with the house then, or the children." "She has children. 5. Husband died of fever 2 winters back." Grace's expression softened. How terrible for her. The conversation lapsed back into silence as they approached a modest farmhouse with a freshly painted white fence. Chickens scattered as the wagon rolled into the yard, and a woman emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Zachariah Mills," she called. "Didn't expect to see you before the cattle auction next month." Zach tipped his hat. "Martha, brought someone might need a place." Martha Henderson was a sturdy woman in her late 30s, with laugh lines around her eyes despite the hardships she'd faced. Her gaze moved to Grace with open curiosity. "This is Miss Grace Owens," Zach said. "From Philadelphia. Needs lodging." Grace descended from the wagon with as much elegance as the dusty circumstances allowed. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, Mrs. Henderson. I find myself in need of accommodation and possibly employment if you have any to offer." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's quite the proper speech." She smiled warmly. "We've got a spare room since Jenny married last spring. Can't pay much, but I could use help with the little ones and their lessons." Relief washed over Grace's face. "I was a music teacher in Philadelphia. I would be delighted to assist with education." "Can you cook?" "Basic dishes, yes. So, quite well, actually." Martha nodded decisively. "Then we'll manage just fine." Zach remained on the wagon, watching the exchange with an odd sense of satisfaction. When Martha invited Grace inside, he prepared to depart. "Mr. Mills," Grace called, turning back. "Thank you for your assistance today. I'm indebted to your kindness." "No debt," he said simply. "Good day, Miss Owens." As he drove away, Zach told himself he was glad to have resolved the situation neatly. The woman was safely placed, and he could return to his solitude without further complications. He told himself he wouldn't think about eyes the color of sage again. He was wrong. 2 weeks passed before Zach returned to Wichita for supplies. He took care of his business efficiently as always: the bank, the blacksmith, Holloway's store, ignoring the usual attempts at conversation and matchmaking. "You hear about that Eastern gal staying at the Henderson place?" Ernest asked as he wrapped Zach's purchases. Zach grunted noncommittally. "Folks say she plays the church organ like an angel, sings too. Martha's kids are learning their letters faster than jackrabbits run." "Good for Martha." Ernest leaned across the counter. "Word is Tucker's still sore about losing her. Been making threats when he's in his cups." Zach's hand stilled momentarily. "What kind of threats?" "Oh, the usual bluster. Says she owes him more than just the train fare. Says he'll collect one way or another." Ernest shrugged. "Sheriff told him to simmer down, but you know Tucker." Zach did know Tucker, a man whose pride exceeded his sense, especially when alcohol was involved. He finished his transaction and left the store, intending to head directly back to his ranch. Instead, he found himself turning his wagon toward the Henderson farm. He told himself it was merely to check on Martha's fence, which had needed repair last he'd seen it. A neighborly gesture, nothing more. The sound reached him before the house came into view: piano music floating through the afternoon air, accompanied by children's voices raised in song. Zach slowed his horses, listening despite himself. The melody was unfamiliar, something light and joyful. As he approached, he saw them gathered on the porch: Martha's 5 children arranged around Grace at a small upright piano that must have been moved from the parlor. Grace's back was straight, her hands moving confidently across the keys, her voice guiding the children through the chorus. Her hair was fully pinned today, revealing the graceful line of her neck. She wore a simple blue dress, modest but becoming. Sunshine caught the amber highlights in her hair as she turned to smile encouragingly at the youngest Henderson child. Something twisted in Zach's chest, a sensation so foreign he almost pulled the wagon around and fled. Instead, he cleared his throat as he drew closer, announcing his presence. The music faltered as Grace looked up. For an instant, something like pleasure flashed across her face before her expression composed itself into polite inquiry. "Mr. Mills," she said. "What a surprise!" Martha emerged from inside the house, wiping flour from her hands. "Zachariah, twice in 1 month the world must be ending." Her teasing smile softened the words. "Passing by," Zach said. "Noticed your north fence still needs shoring up." "Been meaning to get to it," Martha admitted. "Hard to find the time. I can see to it." The children, initially silenced by his arrival, now broke into excited chatter. The youngest Eliza, if he remembered correctly, approached his wagon fearlessly. "Are you really the cowboy that never smiles?" she asked, her missing front teeth creating a slight whistle. "Tommy Wilson says you fought a bear once and didn't even blink." "Eliza," Martha scolded, "mind your manners." Grace's lips twitched with barely suppressed amusement. "Perhaps Mr. Mills would like some refreshment before he tackles the fence." She turned to him. "We've just made lemonade." Zach should have declined. Should have fixed the fence quickly and returned to his ranch, to his routines, to his carefully constructed solitude. Instead, he found himself nodding. Lemonade would be fine. The next hour passed in a blur of unfamiliar domesticity. The children peppered him with questions which he answered with uncharacteristic patience. Martha insisted he stay for an early supper once the fence was repaired. Grace played another song at the children's request. Throughout it all, Zach found his attention repeatedly drawn to Grace. The way she gently corrected young Daniel's grammar, the respectful manner in which she deferred to Martha in household matters, the quiet confidence with which she moved through a world entirely different from the one she'd known in Philadelphia. When supper was finished and the children sent to wash up, Grace walked with him to his wagon. "The Hendersons have been very kind," she said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I'm fortunate you brought me here." Zach nodded. "Martha's good people. I've secured a position at the church as well. Sunday services and Wednesday choir practice." A small smile touched her lips. "Not quite what I envisioned when I came west, but satisfying nonetheless." "Heard Tucker's been making trouble." Grace's smile faded. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned his visits to town. It seems he feels I've damaged his reputation." "Has he approached you?" "No, I rarely go into town and never alone." Zach adjusted his hat. "Good, keep it that way for now. Mr. Mills, I appreciate your concern, but I won't be intimidated into hiding." "Not hiding, being sensible." Grace's chin lifted in that now familiar gesture of defiance. "I've spent much of my life being sensible, Mr. Mills. It's why I came west to live more boldly." "There's a difference between bold and foolhardy, Miss Owens. And who decides which is which? You." Her eyes flashed. "I'm capable of managing my own affairs. Like you did at Tucker's saloon." The words were out before he could stop them, harsher than he'd intended. Grace stepped back as if he'd struck her, hurt momentarily visible before her expression closed. "Good evening, Mr. Mills," she said stiffly. "Thank you for repairing the fence." She turned and walked back to the house, spine rigid, not looking back. Zach stood by his wagon, an unfamiliar sense of regret washing over him. "You've got all the charm of a rattlesnake, Mills," he muttered to himself as he climbed onto the wagon seat. As he drove away, the sound of the piano resumed from the Henderson house, no longer light and joyful, but something melancholy that followed him down the road like an accusation. Grace Owens was becoming a distraction, and Zachariah Mills did not allow distractions in his carefully ordered existence. He resolved to avoid town as much as possible in the coming weeks, sending his ranch hand, Miguel, for supplies instead. But fate had other plans. Early autumn brought the county fair to Wichita, an event that drew ranchers and farmers from miles around. For Zach, it was a business necessity. The cattle auction would determine much of his income for the coming year. He arrived early on the first day, leading his prize bull and 2 heifers to the livestock pavilion. He was discussing breeding lines with a potential buyer when he heard her voice. "The children's choir will perform at 2 o'clock by the main pavilion," Grace was saying to a cluster of women. "All are welcome to attend." She looked different today, more vibrant, more settled. Her dress was still modest, but the deep green color complemented her eyes. A small pin in the shape of a music note adorned her collar. Her hair was arranged more elaborately than he'd seen before, with small white flowers woven into the auburn waves. One of the women noticed him looking and nudged Grace, who turned. Their eyes met across the fairground. Grace hesitated, then excused herself from her companions and approached him. "Mr. Mills," she said with cool politeness, "I see you've brought your livestock to the fair." The buyer, sensing tension, murmured something about returning later and wandered away. "Miss Owens," Zach acknowledged, "here with the Henderson children." "Yes. They're participating in several competitions. Daniel has entered his woodcarving and Sarah has submitted preserves." Pride colored her voice. "They're remarkable children. Martha's done well by them." An awkward silence fell. Grace smoothed her skirts, clearly preparing to depart. "I should apologize," Zach said abruptly, the words feeling strange in his mouth, "for what I said about Tucker's." Surprise flickered across her face. "Oh, it was unkind." Grace studied him, as if trying to reconcile this admission with her understanding of his character. "Thank you, Mr. Mills, I accept your apology." She should have walked away then. Instead, she glanced at his bull, who was calmly chewing his cud. "He's magnificent. Does he have a name?" Thunderhead. A smile touched her lips. "Very dramatic. He's earned it." Zach patted the bull's massive shoulder. "Survived a lightning strike as a calf. Been cantankerous ever since." "I suppose we're all shaped by our experiences," Grace said quietly. The observation hung between them, oddly intimate. Zach shifted uncomfortably, uncertain how to respond. He was saved by Martha's arrival, her youngest daughter in tow. "There you are, Grace. The judges are ready for the children's choir." "Oh, hello, Zachariah." Grace excused herself gracefully, but not before saying, "Perhaps I'll see you at the auction, Mr. Mills." As she walked away, Martha gave Zach a speculative look. "First time I've seen you exchange more than 10 words with anyone outside of business, Zachariah Mills." Zach grunted noncommittally. "She asks about you, you know," Martha continued, her tone deceptively casual. "Wanted to know your story. Why you live alone out there with just Miguel and those cattle for company. What did you tell her? The truth that nobody really knows." Martha adjusted her bonnet. "Would it be so terrible to let someone in, Zach, after all this time?" Before he could answer, little Eliza tugged at Martha's skirt. "Mama, the choir. We're gonna be late." Martha patted Zach's arm. "Think about it. Life's too short for so much solitude." The Henderson family departed, leaving Zach with thoughts he'd rather not examine. Later that afternoon, after successfully auctioning his heifers for a good price, Zach found himself drawn toward the main pavilion. The children's choir had finished, but another performance was underway. Grace at the piano, accompanying a young woman singing a popular ballad. Zach stood at the back of the crowd, hat in hand, watching as Grace's fingers moved across the keys with practiced ease. There was joy in her expression, a contentment that transformed her from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. When the song ended and applause broke out, Grace looked up and scanned the crowd. Her eyes found his, and a small smile curved her lips, not the polite smile she offered to acquaintances, but something warmer, more personal. Zach nodded in acknowledgement. then turned and walked away, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm. He avoided her for the rest of the fair, focusing on business and ignoring the persistent sense that something fundamental was shifting inside him. On the final evening, as he was loading his remaining livestock for the journey home, commotion erupted near the refreshment tents. Raised voices carried on the autumn air, one male, slurred with alcohol, one female, taut with anger. Zach's body was moving before his mind fully registered the voices. Darrell Tucker stood swaying before Grace, his face flushed with drink and rage. "Think you're too good for my establishment, prancing around with your fancy music and your nose in the air." Grace faced him steadily, though Zach could see her hands trembling at her sides. "Please step aside, Mr. Tucker. I have no quarrel with you." "No quarrel," Tucker laughed harshly. "You humiliated me, the whole town laughing about how I got swindled by some Eastern whore." Several onlookers gasped. The sheriff was nowhere in sight. "I suggest you reconsider your language and your accusations," Grace said, her voice remarkably calm despite the circumstances. Tucker stepped closer, towering over her. "Or what? You'll call your protector." "That cold-hearted bastard Mills. I fight my own battles, Mr. Tucker." "Is that so?" Tucker's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Then fight this." Zach broke through the crowd just as Grace's free hand swung up, connecting solidly with Tucker's cheek in a slap that echoed across the suddenly silent fairground. Tucker reeled back, momentarily shocked, then his face contorted with fury. He raised his fist. Zach caught it mid-swing, twisting until Tucker howled in pain. "Told you once to leave her be," Zach said, his voice deadly quiet. "Won't tell you again." "You son of a bitch," Tucker snarled. "Always interfering. She ain't worth it, Mills. Nothing but trouble in a skirt." Zach increased the pressure on Tucker's wrist until the man dropped to one knee. "Apologize to the lady. Go to hell." Zach leaned closer. "Then go to jail. Assaulting a woman's a crime, Tucker. Sheriff Simmons takes a dim view of it." Fear flickered in Tucker's bloodshot eyes as sobriety began to penetrate his rage. The sound of the sheriff's approaching footsteps confirmed the threat. "Fine," Tucker spat. "Sorry, Miss Owens. No harm intended." Zach released him with a shove. "Now get out of town." "Don't come back while she's here." Tucker scrambled to his feet, glaring at both of them. "This ain't over, Mills." "Yes," Zach said with quiet certainty. "It is." As Tucker slunk away, Sheriff Simmons arrived, looking between Zach and Grace with concern. "Everything all right here?" "Just a misunderstanding," Grace said, her voice steady despite her pallor. "It's resolved now." The sheriff didn't look convinced, but nodded. "If you're sure, Miss Owens." When they were relatively alone again, Grace exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Mr. Mills, though I maintain I could have handled the situation." "You were doing fine until he raised his fist," Zach acknowledged. "Good slap." A reluctant smile touched her lips. "My father always said a lady should know how to defend her honor. Your father taught you well." Zach noticed she was still trembling slightly. "Let me see you back to Martha." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "That would be appreciated." As they walked through the fairgrounds, Zach was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the faint scent of lavender, the rustle of her skirts, the way she'd composed herself so quickly after such a confrontation. Most women of his acquaintance would have dissolved into tears. "Tucker won't bother you again," he said. "You sound very certain." "I am." There was no boast in his tone, just simple fact. Grace glanced up at him curiously. "You're a puzzling man, Mr. Mills. Everyone says you prefer solitude, yet you repeatedly intervene on my behalf." Zach kept his eyes forward. "Maybe I don't like bullies. Is that all it is?" The direct question caught him off guard. For a moment he considered deflecting, returning to his customary reticence. but something in her steady gaze demanded honesty. "Don't know what it is," he admitted quietly. Grace studied him for a long moment, then smiled a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Well, whatever your reasons, I'm grateful, though I still maintain I can look after myself." "Never doubted it, Miss Owens." When they reached Martha and the children, Zach tipped his hat in farewell. As he turned to leave, Grace called after him. "Mr. Mills." He looked back. "The Henderson children have been asking when you might visit again. Apparently, you promised Eliza you'd show her how to tie proper knots." He hadn't, but the hopeful look in Grace's eyes made him nod. "Sunday, perhaps, after church." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "We'll expect you then." As Zach rode home that night, he told himself his decision to visit was solely about the children. He'd always had a soft spot for little Eliza, with her gap-toothed smile and fearless questions. It had nothing to do with Grace Owens and her sage green eyes. Nothing at all. Sunday arrived clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn crispness in the air. For the first time in years, Zach found himself standing before the small mirror in his cabin, attempting to tame his unruly dark hair. He'd trimmed his beard, put on his one good shirt, and even polished his boots. Miguel, his ranch hand of 5 years, watched these preparations with poorly concealed amusement. "Going to church, patron?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Visiting the Henderson place," Zach replied gruffly. Miguel nodded sagely. "Ah, where the beautiful music teacher lives." Zach shot him a warning glance. Miguel held up his hands in mock surrender. "I say nothing more, except that it is good to see you among people again." His expression softened. "My grandmother used to say that a heart can only stay closed for so long before it forgets how to open at all." "Your grandmother talked too much," Zach muttered, but without heat. Miguel just smiled and left to tend the horses. Zach arrived at the Henderson farm just as the family was returning from church services. The children spotted him first, rushing forward with excited greetings that made him unexpectedly self-conscious. Grace hung back, watching the interaction with a soft smile. She wore a dress of deep blue today, with a lace collar that emphasized the graceful line of her throat. Her hair was pinned up as usual, but a few wayward curls had escaped to frame her face. "Mr. Mills," she said when the children finally allowed him to approach the adults. "You kept your promise. Said I would." Martha bustled forward, already issuing invitations for dinner, and listing all the chores that coincidentally needed a man's attention around the farm. Zach allowed himself to be swept into the domestic chaos of the Henderson household, finding an unexpected comfort in the noise and activity. Throughout the afternoon, he was aware of Grace's presence teaching Sarah to play a simple tune on the piano, helping Martha with dinner preparations, gently mediating a squabble between the younger children. She moved through these tasks with quiet confidence, occasionally glancing his way with a smile that made his chest tighten. After dinner, while Martha put the youngest children down for naps, Zach found himself alone with Grace on the front porch. She sat in a rocking chair, mending one of Daniel's shirts with neat, precise stitches. "The children adore you," she said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Especially Eliza. She's been practicing those knots all afternoon. Smart kid, quick learner." Grace's needle flashed in the sunlight. "They need a male influence. They miss their father terribly." "Martha does well by them, she does, but there are things a mother can't provide no matter how capable she is." Grace glanced up at him. "You're good with them, patient." Zach shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "Just knots." "It's more than that." She set aside her mending. "You listen to them. Truly listen. You know how rare that is, for children to feel truly heard by adults." Zach didn't know how to respond to the observation or the warmth in her eyes as she made it. "Why did you really come west, Miss Owens?" He asked instead. If she was surprised by the abrupt change of subject, she didn't show it. "I told you, for opportunity." "There's more." Grace's hand stilled in her lap. For a moment he thought she might deflect the question, but then she sighed. "My fiancé ended our engagement 3 days before the wedding," she said quietly. "He had found someone with better connections, better prospects, someone younger." Anger flickered through Zach at the thought of anyone treating her so callously. "It wasn't just the humiliation," Grace continued, "though that was considerable. It was the realization that I'd spent my entire life following a prescribed path, dutiful daughter, accomplished young lady, prospective wife, without ever questioning if it was what I truly wanted." "And what do you want?" Her eyes met his, startlingly direct. "To live authentically, to make my own choices, good or bad, to be valued for who I am, not for what I represent or what I can provide." The honesty of her answer resonated somewhere deep inside him, touching a part of himself he'd locked away long ago. "Your turn, Mr. Mills," Grace said softly. "Everyone in town has a theory about why you live as you do, alone, remote, avoiding connections. What's the truth?" Zach stood, moving to the porch railing, his back to her. The question hung between them, demanding an honesty he rarely offered. "Lost my family in '57, he finally said, the words rough. "Cholera, mother, father, 2 sisters. I was 15. Behind him he heard Grace's soft intake of breath, but no platitudes, no empty sympathy. "Went to live with my uncle. Mean drunk. Ran away at 17. Worked ranches until the war broke out." His fingers tightened on the railing. "Saw things during those years, did things, came back different. The war between the states changes everyone it touched," Grace said quietly. "Bought my land in '66, built it up. Figured out that people are easier to understand from a distance." He turned to face her. "Simpler that way." "Simpler, perhaps," Grace acknowledged, "but lonelier too, I would imagine." Their eyes met, and Zach felt something shift between them, a deepening, a recognition. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly see another person, and to be seen in return. Martha's return with the children broke the moment. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity, more knot tying for Eliza, helping Daniel repair a broken chair, listening to Sarah practice her piano lessons under Grace's patient guidance. When it was time to leave, the entire Henderson family gathered on the porch to bid him farewell. As he prepared to mount his horse, Grace stepped forward. "Will you come again?" she asked, her voice pitched for his ears alone. The question contained multitudes, an invitation, a challenge, a possibility. "Yes," Zach said, surprising himself with the immediacy of his response. "Next Sunday." Her smile was worth every moment of discomfort his answer had cost him. Over the following weeks, Sunday visits to the Henderson farm became a fixture in Zach's life. Each visit peeled back another layer of reserve, both his and Grace's. He learned that she had a quick wit beneath her proper exterior, that she could recite Shakespeare from memory, that she hummed unconsciously while concentrating on a task. She learned that he had taught himself to read by lamplight after long days of ranch work, that he carved wooden figures for the Henderson children when his hands needed occupation, that he remembered every constellation his father had shown him as a boy. October brought the harvest, and with it, a barn raising for the Wilsons, whose property bordered Martha's. The entire community gathered to help, men constructing the framework, while women prepared food and children darted between groups, alternately helping and hindering. Zach worked alongside the other men, aware of Grace moving among the women's area, helping to organize the feast that would follow the day's labor. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the busy yard, a moment of connection before returning to their respective tasks. By mid-afternoon, the barn's framework stood tall against the autumn sky. As the men began work on the roof, the women called everyone to break for refreshments. Zach wiped sweat from his brow and accepted a cup of cider from Martha. "Grace made apple pies," she said with a knowing smile. "Said they were your favorite." Zach glanced toward the food tables, where Grace was serving slices to the workers. He hadn't explicitly told her he favored apple pie, but she'd noticed his preference during Sunday dinners. The realization that she'd observed him so carefully, remembered his preferences, created a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. As the afternoon wore on, musicians set up for the dance that traditionally followed a barn raising. Zach had always departed before this portion of the event in previous years, but today he lingered, watching as Grace took her place at a borrowed piano. The music began lively reels and jigs that soon had couples forming sets on the packed earth of the yard. Zach remained on the periphery, content to observe rather than participate, until Martha approached with determination in her stride. "Zachariah Mills, you've been staring at that girl for weeks now," she said without preamble. "Are you planning to dance with her, or shall I find someone who will?" Zach blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "She's playing the music, Martha, and Josiah Taylor's son can take over for a song or two." Martha fixed him with a stern look. "That girl deserves some fun and you deserve some happiness. Don't be stubborn about this." Before Zach could formulate a response, Martha had marched over to the piano and engaged in a brief, hushed conversation with Grace, whose eyes widened before flickering to where Zach stood. A blush rose in her cheeks as young Taylor took her place at the piano. Martha led Grace toward Zach with the air of a general advancing troops. "Here she is, all arranged. Now dance with the poor girl before she thinks you don't want to." With that pronouncement, Martha disappeared into the crowd, leaving Zach and Grace facing each other awkwardly. "Mrs. Henderson is quite forceful when she sets her mind to something," Grace said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "You don't have to dance," Zach said quickly. "If you'd rather not." Grace's expression softened. "I'd like to dance with you, Mr. Mills, if you're willing." The music shifted to a waltz. Zach hesitated only a moment before extending his hand. "Been a while," he warned. "I'll follow your lead," Grace said, placing her hand in his. The contact sent awareness coursing through him. Her hand was smaller than his, but strong, a musician's hands, capable and sure. As he placed his other hand at her waist and led her into the dance, Zach was conscious of the eyes upon them, the whispers circulating through the gathering. Zachariah Mills was dancing with Grace Owens, the confirmed bachelor and the Eastern music teacher. "People are staring," Grace murmured, pink tinging her cheeks. "Let them," Zach replied, surprising himself with the ease of his response. As they moved together, the rest of the gathering seemed to fade away. Grace was light in his arms, her steps matching his as if they'd danced together 100 times before. The scent of lavender surrounded him, and her eyes, those remarkable sage-green eyes, held his without wavering. "You dance very well for someone who claims to be out of practice, Mr. Mills," she said. "My mother taught me, said every gentleman should know how to waltz properly." "She taught you well." The simple compliment, delivered with genuine warmth, loosened something in Zach's chest. "What about you? Where did you learn?" Philadelphia society requires accomplished young ladies to master the social graces. A shadow crossed her face. "My former fiancé was particularly fond of dancing, though never with me as it turned out. His loss," Zach said simply. Grace looked up at him, surprise giving way to a smile that transformed her face. "That's possibly the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time, Mr. Mills." "Zach," he said impulsively. "My friends call me Zach. Are we friends, then?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. The music was drawing to a close around them, but neither moved to break apart. "I'd like to think so," Zach said finally. "Though I'm out of practice at that, too." "Well then, Zach," Grace said, his name soft on her lips. "I accept your friendship, and you may call me Grace." The waltz ended, and reluctantly they stepped apart. But something fundamental had shifted between them, a door opened that could not easily be closed again. As October gave way to November, Zach found himself drawn to town more frequently. He discovered errands that needed attention, supplies that needed replenishing, often timing his visits to coincide with Grace's choir practices or piano lessons at the church. He would find reasons to escort her back to the Henderson farm afterward. Those journeys filled with conversations that ranged from literature to ranching, from music to the war, from childhood memories to hopes for the future. For the first time in years, Zach felt the walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Miguel noticed the change in his employer immediately. "The señorita must be very special," he observed one evening as Zach prepared to ride into town for a church social he would normally have avoided at all costs. "Just being neighborly," Zach muttered. Miguel's knowing smile spoke volumes. "Of course, patron. Very neighborly to put on your good boots to listen to a choir practice." Zach scowled, but there was no real anger behind it. "Mind the south pasture tonight. Think the gray mare's close to foaling. I will watch the horses, and you will watch the señorita with the beautiful eyes," Miguel said cheerfully. "A good arrangement, no?" Zach didn't dignify that with a response, but as he rode toward town, he couldn't deny the anticipation building within him at the thought of seeing Grace again. The church was lit from within as he approached, lanterns casting a warm glow through windows frosted with the season's first cold snap. Inside, the choir was arranged near the altar, their voices rising in harmonious preparation for the upcoming Thanksgiving service. Grace sat at the piano, her profile illuminated by lamplight as she guided the singers through a difficult passage. She wore a russet-colored dress that complemented her hair, which was arranged more simply than usual, with soft waves falling around her shoulders. Zach took a seat in the back pew, content to observe without drawing attention. There was a joy in her expression as she played that captivated him, a complete immersion in the music, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that transcended the humble surroundings. When the practice concluded and the choir members dispersed, Grace remained at the piano, fingers moving through a more complex piece that Zach didn't recognize. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice his approach until he was standing beside the instrument. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "What is it?" Grace looked up, surprise giving way to pleasure at the sight of him. "Chopin, a nocturne, my father's favorite." Her fingers stilled on the keys. "I didn't expect to see you tonight. Thought you might want company on the ride back to Martha's." Her smile deepened. "That would be lovely, though I'm afraid you missed most of the practice. Heard enough." He gestured toward the piano. "Would you play more, just for a bit?" Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Sit with me." The piano bench was narrow, but Zach settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance despite the intimacy of the setting. As Grace began to play again, he watched her hands, strong, capable hands that could coax such beauty from the instrument. "My mother played," he said, the admission surprising them both. "Not like this. Simple tunes, hymns mostly, but I remember the sound of it in our cabin at night." Grace's expression softened, but she didn't stop playing. "Music has a way of preserving memories." of keeping those we've lost close to us. Haven't thought about it in years, Zach admitted, her playing but hearing you. He trailed off, unable to articulate the complex emotions her music stirred in him, grief long buried, memories both painful and precious, and something new, something hopeful that he scarcely dared name. Grace seemed to understand without further explanation. The piece she was playing shifted subtly into something simpler, sweeter, a melody that tugged at the edges of Zach's memory. "My mother used to sing this," he said with quiet wonder. "How did you know?" "I didn't," Grace admitted, continuing to play, "but it's an old folk song. Many mothers sang it." Without conscious thought, Zach began to hum along, the melody returning to him across the years. Grace's fingers faltered momentarily in surprise, then continued, supporting his hesitant tune. When the song ended, they sat in silence, the last notes hanging in the air between them. Something profound had passed between them, a sharing of memory, of vulnerability that went beyond words. "Thank you," Zach said simply. Grace's eyes met his, and in them he saw understanding, compassion, and something deeper that made his heart quicken. "Music can heal wounds we didn't even know were still open," she said softly. The moment stretched between them, intimate and charged. Zach became acutely aware of their proximity on the narrow bench, of the subtle scent of lavender that surrounded her, of how easy it would be to lean forward, and the church door opened with a bang as the pastor returned for his forgotten Bible, breaking the spell. "Oh, Miss Owens, Mr. Mills," he said, clearly surprised to find them still there. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Not at all, Pastor," Grace said, rising smoothly from the bench. "We were just leaving. I was showing Mr. Mills some of the music for the Thanksgiving service." As they prepared to depart, the pastor gave them a speculative look. "Will you be joining us for Thanksgiving dinner at the church, Mr. Mills? Miss Owens has organized quite a celebration for those without family to dine with." The implication that he fell into that category stung more than Zach expected. "Haven't decided," he said noncommittally. "You would be most welcome," the pastor persisted. "Miss Owens has been quite insistent that all are invited, especially those who might otherwise spend the day alone." Grace's cheeks colored slightly. The holiday should be about community after all. Outside, as Zach helped Grace onto his wagon for the ride to the Henderson farm, he found himself curious about her plans. "Didn't realize you were organizing Thanksgiving at the church." "It seemed important," she said, arranging her skirts. "So many people in town are far from their families or have lost loved ones. No one should be alone on Thanksgiving if they don't wish to be. Including me." There was no accusation in his tone, merely inquiry. Grace met his gaze directly. "Especially you." "Why especially?" She hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Because I think perhaps you've been alone long enough, Zach." The simple statement, delivered without artifice, struck him with unexpected force. For years, he'd told himself that solitude was his preference, his choice. He'd built his ranch, his life, around that premise. But sitting beside Grace in the gathering dusk, he suddenly couldn't remember why isolation had seemed so necessary. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Her smile was like sunrise. "That's all I ask." As November deepened toward Thanksgiving, Wichita experienced its first significant snowfall. The white blanket transformed the landscape, softening the harsh lines of the prairie and muffling sounds to a hushed stillness. Zach stood on his porch, watching the snow accumulate, thinking of Grace. She'd mentioned never having experienced a proper prairie winter, her eyes alight with anticipation at the prospect of snow. The impulse to ride to the Henderson farm, to show her the beauty of the freshly fallen snow, was strong. But the weather was worsening, visibility poor, It would be foolish to attempt the journey. Instead, he returned to his work, forcing his thoughts away from sage green eyes and conversations that lingered in his mind long after they'd ended. That evening, as the storm intensified, someone pounded on his door. Zach opened it to find Tom Wilson, Martha's neighbor, his horse steaming in the cold. "Mills," he gasped, his face red with cold and exertion. "Thank God you're home." "What's happened?" "It's Martha's boy, Daniel. Took a fall from the loft. Arms broken bad, maybe worse. Martha sent me to fetch the doctor, but with this storm." He gestured helplessly at the swirling snow. "Doctor's in town," Zach said, already reaching for his coat. 10 miles in this weather." "I know. I'm heading there now, but Martha asked if you could come. Said you had experience with breaks from the war." Zach nodded grimly. Field hospitals had taught him more than he ever wanted to know about broken bones. "I'll go. You get the doctor if you can, but be careful. Storm's getting worse." Within minutes, Zach was on his most sure-footed horse, fighting his way through the blinding snow toward the Henderson farm. Concern for Daniel drove him forward, but thoughts of Grace were equally compelling. Would she be frightened by the storm, by Daniel's injury? When he finally reached the farm, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Martha met him at the door, her normally composed face tight with worry. "Thank God," she said, ushering him inside. "He's in terrible pain, Zach." Daniel lay on the sofa in the parlor, his face ashen, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. Grace knelt beside him, speaking softly as she bathed his forehead with a cool cloth. The other children huddled nearby, wide-eyed with fear. When she saw Zach, relief flooded Grace's features. "You came." "Course I did." He removed his snow-covered coat and hat, approaching the injured boy. "Let me see, Daniel." The break was bad compound, with the bone visible through torn skin. The kind of injury that could kill a man from infection if not properly treated, or leave him crippled if the bone wasn't set correctly. "Tom's gone for the doctor," Zach told Martha quietly. "But in this storm—" "Can you help him?" Martha asked, her voice breaking. "Please, Zach." Zach looked at the boy's pale face, at the trust in his eyes despite the pain. "Going to need boiling water," he said decisively. "Clean cloths, whiskey if you have it, and something for him to bite down on." As Martha hurried to gather supplies, Zach turned to Grace. "Get the little ones out of here. They don't need to see this." Grace nodded, her face composed despite the fear in her eyes. "Come along, children," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go to the kitchen and make some hot chocolate while Mr. Mills helps Daniel. Will Daniel be all right?" Eliza asked tearfully. Grace knelt to the child's level. "Mr. Mills is going to take very good care of him. Remember how he fixed Mr. Whiskers when his leg was hurt?" She referred to a kitten Zach had splinted during a previous visit. "Daniel is much stronger than Mr. Whiskers, so he'll be just fine." The simple reassurance seemed to satisfy the children, who allowed themselves to be led from the room. Grace's quiet competence in the crisis impressed Zach. There was no hysteria, no helpless weeping, just practical action. What followed was a grim hour of work. With Martha's assistance, Zach cleaned the wound, eased the bone back into position, and splinted the arm securely. Daniel bore it with remarkable courage, though he eventually passed out from the pain, a blessing in Zach's view. When it was done, and Daniel was sleeping with the aid of laudanum from Martha's medicine chest, Zach stepped outside onto the porch to clear his head. The snow continued to fall heavily, transforming the world into a white void. Tom and the doctor wouldn't make it back tonight. The door opened behind him and Grace emerged with a steaming cup. "Hot coffee," she said, offering it to him. "You must be frozen." Zach accepted the cup gratefully, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "How's Martha holding up?" "She's sitting with Daniel now. I think the worst has passed." Grace wrapped her shawl tighter against the cold. "That was remarkable, what you did. Martha says he might have lost the arm without your help." Zach shrugged uncomfortably. "Seen worse. Done worse. In the war," he nodded, sipping the strong coffee. "Field hospitals aren't pretty places." Grace moved closer, seemingly unbothered by the cold. "You saved that boy's arm tonight, possibly his life. That counts for something, Zach. Just did what needed doing." He glanced at her, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. "You handled it well, the children, keeping calm." "I've had practice maintaining composure in difficult situations." A wry smile touched her lips. "Being publicly jilted teaches one to control one's emotions." The casual reference to her past pain stirred something protective in Zach. "Man was a fool," he said simply. Grace's eyes widened slightly at the bluntness of his assessment. "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps it was for the best. I wouldn't be here otherwise." The implication hung in the air between them that circumstances, however painful, had led her to this place, this moment, standing beside him in the snow. The door opened again as Martha peered out. "Storm's getting worse," she said. "You'll not make it home tonight, Zach. I've made up the sofa in the study for you." Before Zach could respond, she disappeared back inside, the matter apparently settled. "Martha Henderson," Grace said with a small laugh, "is the most efficiently bossy woman I've ever known." "True enough," Zach agreed, a reluctant smile tugging at his lips. "Best not to argue with her." They stood together a moment longer, watching the snow fall in the lantern light before returning to the warmth of the house. The night passed slowly. Zach checked on Daniel periodically, relieved to find the boy's color improving and no sign of fever developing. Between these vigils, he dozed fitfully on the sofa in Martha's small study, his thoughts drifting repeatedly to Grace, asleep upstairs. Morning brought a temporary break in the storm and the arrival of the doctor, who confirmed Zach's treatment had been appropriate and likely saved the boy from permanent disability. The praise made Zach uncomfortable, but the relief in Martha's eyes and the pride in Grace's made something warm unfurl in his chest. As he prepared to depart, Grace walked with him to the barn where his horse was stabled. "Will you come for Thanksgiving?" she asked as he saddled his mount. "It's only 3 days away." Zach adjusted the cinch, buying time. The events of the night had shifted something fundamental between them, a deepening of connection, of trust that both attracted and alarmed him. "Please," Grace said softly when his silence stretched too long. "I'd very much like you to be there." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "Why?" The simple question caught her off guard. "Why? Why's it matter to you if I come or not?" Grace drew herself up slightly, her chin lifting in that now familiar gesture of quiet determination. "Because I care about you, Zachariah Mills. Because I think you deserve to be surrounded by people who care about you, especially during the holidays." She took a breath. "Because I think perhaps you've convinced yourself you prefer solitude when what you really fear is loss." The assessment was so accurate, so penetrating that Zach felt momentarily exposed, as if she'd peered directly into the carefully guarded chambers of his heart. "Not afraid of anything," he said gruffly. "No." Her voice was gentle, but her eyes challenged him. "Then prove it. Come to Thanksgiving dinner. Sit at a table with people who value your company. Allow yourself that much." Put that way, it sounded like a dare rather than an invitation. Zach had never been one to back down from a challenge. "Fine," he said. "I'll be there." Grace's smile was luminous. 2 o'clock. Don't be late." As Zach rode home through the snow-covered landscape, he replayed their conversation, particularly her words, "I care about you." It had been so long since anyone had expressed such a sentiment to him, so long since he'd allowed anyone close enough to form such an attachment, that he wasn't entirely sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to retreat, to re-establish the emotional distance that had protected him for so long. But another part, a part growing stronger with each encounter, wanted to see where this path might lead. Thanksgiving Day dawned clear and cold, the recent snowfall glistening under a bright sun. Zach stood before his mirror, adjusting his collar with uncharacteristic attention to his appearance. He'd shaved carefully, trimmed his hair, and donned his best suit attire usually reserved for funerals and bank meetings. Miguel, passing the open door, stopped short. "Dios mío," he exclaimed. "Who has died?" "No one," Zach muttered, uncomfortable under scrutiny. Miguel's expression transformed into a knowing grin. "Ah, the señorita has dinner. You wish to impress her? No, it's a church function. Just being respectful." "Of course, patron. Very respectful to wear your finest boots and put pomade in your hair." Zach scowled at his reflection. "Shouldn't you be checking the herd?" Miguel's laughter followed him as he departed, leaving Zach to wonder if he was indeed making a fool of himself. It had been so long since he'd cared about such matters that he felt oddly adrift, unsure of the social currents around him. When he arrived at the church, the building was already bustling with activity. Tables had been arranged in the meeting hall, covered with white cloths and decorated with pine boughs and dried berries. The smell of roasting turkey and baking pies filled the air. Grace was at the center of it all, directing volunteers, adjusting decorations, her face animated with purpose and pleasure. She wore a gown of deep green velvet that brought out the color of her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant twist with a few strategic curls framing her face. When she spotted him in the doorway, her entire countenance brightened. "Zach, you came," said I would. She approached, her smile warm. "And you're early. That's even better. We could use another pair of strong hands to move the piano." For the next hour, Zach found himself integrated into the preparations, moving furniture, hanging decorations, carving the massive turkeys that emerged from the church's modest kitchen. Through it all, he was aware of Grace, her voice directing the choir boys in a brief rehearsal, her laughter as she helped Martha arrange place settings, the brush of her skirts as she moved past him in the narrow kitchen. By the time guests began arriving for the meal, Zach had almost forgotten his initial discomfort. Grace introduced him to newcomers not as the reclusive rancher, but as "my dear friend, Mr. Mills," the simple designation warming him more than he cared to admit. As they took their places for the meal, Grace arranged for him to sit beside her, with Martha and the Henderson children across from them. The pastor said grace, giving special thanks for community and friendship in the harsh prairie winter. The meal was abundant, the conversation lively. Zach found himself drawn into discussions about cattle prices, town improvements, and the children's school activities. He spoke more during those 2 hours than he typically did in a week, and was surprised to find he didn't mind it. Throughout the meal, he was acutely conscious of Grace beside him, her occasional touch on his arm to emphasize a point, the approving glance when he helped young Eliza cut her turkey, the way she seemed to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, refilling his coffee or passing the potatoes just as he was about to ask. When dessert was served, including Grace's apple pie, which she'd made especially with him in mind, Zach realized with a jolt of surprise that he was enjoying himself. More than that, he was experiencing a sense of belonging that had been absent from his life for far too long. After the meal, as the tables were cleared and the piano moved into position for an informal concert, Grace found a moment alone with him near the church entrance. "Thank you for coming," she said. "It meant a great deal to me." "It was a fine dinner," Zach said. You worked hard on it. Grace smiled. Not just the dinner, having you here being part of things. I've watched you these past months, Zach, slowly opening doors that have been closed for so long. Her perception was unsettling but not unwelcome. Been a while, he admitted, since I sat at a table that full. And was it so terrible? There was gentle teasing in her tone but genuine inquiry as well. No, Zach said honestly. It wasn't terrible at all. Grace's expression softened. I meant what I said the other day. I do care about you. She hesitated, then added quietly, more than I probably should. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable. Zach felt something shift inside him, a wall crumbling, a door opening wider. Grace, he began, unsure what he meant to say but feeling the need to respond to her honesty with his own. Before he could continue, Martha appeared, apologetic but insistent. Grace, dear, they're waiting for you to begin the music. Everyone's seated. Grace's eyes held his for a moment longer, filled with unspoken words. We'll talk later, she promised, before allowing Martha to lead her back to the gathering. The concert was modest, but heartfelt, the choir singing seasonal hymns, several children performing recitations, and Grace playing pieces both sacred and secular on the piano. When she performed a complex classical piece from memory, her fingers flying across the keys with passion and precision, Zach felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. She was remarkable, not just her talent, but her spirit, her resilience, her capacity for joy despite past disappointments. Watching her, surrounded by the community she'd helped build in her short time in Wichita, Zach felt something crystallize within him, a certainty, a recognition of what had been growing between them these past months. As the evening concluded and people began dispersing to their homes, Zach waited patiently, helping with cleanup until only a few volunteers remained. Grace approached him as he was stacking the last of the chairs. "May I ask a favor?" she said. "Martha took the children home already, since Daniel still needs extra care. I stayed to finish organizing the music for Sunday. Would you mind terribly giving me a ride back to the farm?" "Course not." Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars blazing in a black sky. Zach helped Grace into his wagon, tucking a warm blanket around her against the chill. As they drove away from town, the silence between them was comfortable, expectant. "It's beautiful," Grace said, gazing up at the star-filled expanse. "So many more stars than I ever saw in Philadelphia." "Less city lights to interfere," Zach said. "My father used to say we could see all the way to heaven out here." Grace glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you believe that? In heaven?" It was a more profound question than any they'd yet discussed. Zach considered his answer carefully. "Used to, before the war, after that." He shrugged, seemed less certain. And now, Zach looked at her, really looked at her, illuminated by starlight, her eyes reflecting the vast heavens above them. "Now I think maybe there's grace in unexpected places." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. A smile touched her lips. "That's possibly the most poetic thing I've ever heard you say, Zachariah Mills. Don't get used to it." Her laugh was warm in the cold night. "Too late. I've already become quite accustomed to the man beneath the stoic exterior." They fell silent again as the wagon approached a bend in the road where the Henderson farm would come into view. But instead of continuing, Zach reined in the horses. Grace looked at him questioningly. "Is something wrong?" "Need to say something," Zach said, the words coming with difficulty. "While it's just us." Grace turned toward him, her full attention on his face. "I'm listening." Zach removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt important somehow. "You said you care for me more than you should." "Yes," she admitted quietly. "I did say that." No one's cared much about what happens to me in a long while, Zach said, the confession raw in his throat. Got used to it that way. Easier. Is it really easier? Grace asked gently. Or just safer? The question pierced him with its accuracy. Maybe both, and now. Zach met her gaze directly. Now I find myself thinking about you when you're not there, wondering what you'd say about things, how you'd see them. He took a breath. Can't remember the last time I cared what someone else thought, but I care what you think, Grace. I care a great deal. The admission cost him something, a piece of the armor he'd worn for so long, but the look on Grace's face made it worthwhile. Oh, Zach, she said softly, her eyes luminous in the starlight. I think about you too, all the time. I'm not an easy man, he warned. Set in my ways. Been alone a long time. I'm not asking you to change who you are, Grace said. Just to consider the possibility that who you are might include room for someone else. It was exactly the right thing to say, not demanding transformation, just expansion, an opening rather than a reconstruction. Slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, Zach reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his willingly, warmly. I'm considering it, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Grace's smile was like sunrise in the midnight darkness. That's all I ask. For now. They remained that way for a long moment, hands joined, eyes locked, something precious and fragile growing between them. Then Zach replaced his hat and guided the horses forward toward the Henderson farm, still holding Grace's hand beneath the blanket. It was a small step, but for a man who had walked alone for so long, it felt monumental. December arrived with bitter cold and the festive preparations for Christmas. Wichita transformed into a holiday scene, with pine boughs decorating storefronts and red ribbons adorning lamp posts. The church organized a special Christmas program, with Grace at its center as musical director. Zach found himself in town more frequently, ostensibly to deliver lumber for the nativity scene being constructed in the churchyard, but primarily to see Grace. Their connection had deepened since Thanksgiving, evolving into something neither could deny nor easily define. They had not progressed beyond hand-holding and meaningful glances, both conscious of propriety and the watchful eyes of the town. But in those brief moments of connection, fingers touching as Zach helped Grace down from his wagon, a shared smile across a crowded room, quiet conversations on the Henderson porch, something profound was taking shape. 2 weeks before Christmas, Zach arrived at the church to find Grace alone, arranging music for the children's choir. Snow fell gently outside, visible through the tall windows, creating a peaceful backdrop to the scene. You're early, Grace said, pleasure evident in her voice. The children won't be here for choir practice for another hour. Came to see you, Zach said simply. Not the choir, her smile deepened. Well, I'm delighted by the surprise. Would you like some tea? Pastor Williams always keeps the kettle on in his study. As they sat together in the pastor's modest office, cups of steaming tea warming their hands, Zach found himself studying Grace's profile. There was a contentment about her that hadn't been there when they first met, a sense of belonging, of purpose fulfilled. You've changed, he observed. Grace glanced up, surprised. Have I, since you arrived? You're settled now, at peace. She considered this assessment thoughtfully. I suppose I am. When I first came to Kansas, I was running from something, from disappointment, from society's judgment, from a future that had suddenly closed to me. She smiled. Now I feel as though I'm running toward something instead. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. The children's Christmas pageant is coming along wonderfully, Grace continued, changing the subject slightly. Little Eliza is to be an angel. She's so excited about her wings. Martha mentioned it, said you've been working hard. It's a joy, truly. Grace's eyes lit with enthusiasm. We've added a living nativity this year. The Parker family has offered their new lamb, and Thomas Henderson will portray Joseph. She hesitated. We're still in need of someone to lead the wise men, someone tall with a natural dignity. Zach nearly choked on his tea. If you're suggesting, you would be perfect, Grace said quickly. The children already admire you so, and it's only walking across the churchyard following the star. A few minutes at most. I don't perform, Grace. It's hardly a performance, more a participation in community tradition. She set down her cup, her expression earnest. The children would be so thrilled. Zach knew he was being manipulated, but found he didn't particularly mind. The prospect of disappointing both Grace and the Henderson children was somehow worse than the temporary discomfort of participation. No speaking parts, he stipulated. Grace's face brightened. None whatsoever, just walking and presenting a gift at the manger. She reached across the small table, covering his hand with hers. Thank you, Zach. It means a great deal to me. The warmth of her touch, the sincerity in her eyes, made any lingering reluctance fade away. For her, he would do this and more. As the Christmas pageant preparations intensified, Zach found himself drawn further into the community's celebrations. He helped construct the wooden stable in the churchyard, attended rehearsals to understand his role, and even allowed himself to be measured for the costume Grace insisted was essential for authenticity. Miguel observed these developments with undisguised amusement. Next you will be singing in the choir, patron, he teased as Zach prepared for a rehearsal one evening. Don't push your luck, Zach growled, but without heat. Miguel's expression softened. It is good to see you like this, living again, not just existing. Before Zach could respond to this unexpected observation, Miguel added casually, the señorita should see your woodworking. The things you carve when you think no one is watching. Zach frowned. They're just whittling, passing time. They are art, Miguel corrected firmly. The birds that seem ready to fly, the horses with every muscle perfect. You have a gift, patron. The suggestion lingered in Zach's mind as he rode to town. He'd never considered his occasional carvings as anything meaningful, just a way to keep his hands busy during long winter evenings. But Grace had mentioned wanting something special for Martha's children for Christmas. The idea took root, growing stronger with each passing day. In the week before Christmas, as the final preparations for the pageant were underway, Wichita was hit by another significant snowstorm. The temperature plummeted, and travel became difficult, even dangerous. Zach worked through the worst of the weather, ensuring his cattle were protected and provided for. When the storm finally broke, he made his way to town, concerned about conditions there, and though he wouldn't admit it aloud, anxious to see Grace after several days' separation. He found her at the church, helping to clear snow from the paths in preparation for Christmas Eve services just 2 days away. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, her breath visible in the frigid air. You shouldn't be out in this, he said by way of greeting, taking the shovel from her gloved hands. Hello to you too, Grace replied, smiling despite his gruff tone. I'm perfectly fine. The exercise is invigorating. It's 10 degrees. Martha know you're out here. Martha is tending to Daniel, whose arm is healing nicely. Thank you for asking. Grace's eyes danced with amusement at his protective manner. And I'm 26 years old, quite capable of deciding when to shovel snow. Zach began clearing the path with efficient strokes, not entirely convinced. Grace watched him work, her expression softening. I was worried about you out at your ranch during the storm. Miguel, too. Been through worse, Zach said, though her concern warmed him. Ranch is built solid. Plenty of supplies. Still, I'm glad to see you well." She hesitated, then added, "I missed you." Zach paused in his shoveling, looking up to meet her gaze. "Missed you too," he admitted quietly. The simple exchange, honest and unadorned, carried more meaning than flowery declarations might have. For a moment they stood in the snow, connected by something deeper than words could express. "I have something for you," Zach said abruptly. "For Christmas. But I'd like to give it to you before the pageant, privately." Surprise and pleasure lit Grace's features. "I have something for you as well." "When would you like to exchange gifts?" "Tomorrow evening. Could come by Martha's after supper." "That would be perfect. The children will be in bed early, excited for Christmas Eve." She smiled. "I'll look forward to it." The next evening, Zach arrived at the Henderson farm with more nervousness than he'd felt in years. The small wooden box in his pocket seemed suddenly inadequate, too simple for the sentiment it was meant to convey. Martha greeted him with knowing warmth, directing him to the parlor where Grace waited. "Don't stay too late, you two," she said with motherly authority. "Christmas Eve is a busy day." Grace sat by the fire, a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red ribbon on the table beside her. She wore a simple dress of deep blue, her hair loose around her shoulders in a less formal style than usual. "Merry Christmas," she said, rising to greet him. "Not Christmas yet," Zach pointed out, removing his hat. "Near enough." She gestured for him to sit. "Would you like some cider?" Martha mulled it with spices earlier. The domesticity of the scene, the warm fire, the holiday decorations, Grace pouring cider into ceramic mugs created an intimacy that both comforted and unnerved him. This was what a home should feel like, he realized. Not just shelter, but warmth. Connection. "Care, should I go first?" Grace asked when they were settled, indicating the package beside her. "Or would you prefer you go?" Zach said, suddenly self-conscious about his own gift. Grace handed him the package with a smile that contained a hint of nervousness. "It's not much," she warned. "But I hope you'll like it." Zach unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a leather-bound book. Opening it, he found blank pages of high-quality paper with a simple inscription on the first page. "For memories worth preserving. With affection, Grace." "It's a journal," she explained. "I noticed you sometimes write things down, figures for the ranch, observations about the cattle. I thought perhaps you might enjoy having a proper place for your thoughts." The thoughtfulness of the gift, the way she'd noticed his habits, considered what might be useful and meaningful to him, touched Zach deeply. "It's perfect," he said simply. "Thank you." Grace's smile deepened at his evident pleasure. "You're very welcome." Now it was his turn. Zach reached into his pocket and withdrew the small wooden box, plainly made but carefully polished. "It's not fancy," he said, placing it in her hands. "Made it myself." Grace opened the box with careful fingers, her breath catching as she saw what lay inside. It was a carving, small enough to fit in her palm, a perfect miniature piano with a tiny figure seated at it, her head bent in concentration over the keys. The detail was exquisite, from the individual piano keys to the curls of the figure's hair. "Zach," she whispered, lifting it gently from the box. "This is incredible. You made this," he nodded, watching her reaction carefully. "Been carving since I was a boy. Never made much of it, just something to do with my hands." "This is art," Grace said firmly, echoing Miguel's assessment. "True art. The detail, the expression. I can almost hear the music." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "No one has ever given me something so personal, so meaningful." "There's more," Zach said. "Turn it over." Grace carefully flipped the carving to reveal words burned into the wooden base. "For Grace, who brought music back to a silent world." The inscription, simple, direct, profoundly honest, brought tears to her eyes. "Oh, Zach," she murmured, "it's the most beautiful gift I've ever received." Setting the carving carefully on the table, Grace moved to sit beside him on the sofa, taking his hands in hers. "Thank you, not just for the gift, but for what it represents, for letting me into your world." The firelight played across her features, highlighting the auburn in her hair, the depth in her eyes. Zach reached up slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Grace," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. She leaned forward slightly, a silent invitation. Zach closed the remaining distance between them, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss both tender and reverent. Her hands came up to rest against his chest, neither pushing away nor pulling closer, simply connecting. When they parted, Grace's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. When she opened them, the emotion Zach saw there mirrored what he felt in his own heart: wonder, joy, and a dawning recognition that something significant had changed between them. "I think," Grace said softly, "that I am falling in love with you, Zachariah Mills." The words hung in the air, honest and vulnerable. A year ago, even 6 months ago, they would have sent Zach retreating behind his carefully constructed walls. Now they felt like coming home. "Think I'm already there," he admitted, the words rough with emotion. "Have been for a while now." Grace's smile was radiant. "And does that frighten you? Being in love again terrifies me," Zach said honestly, "but not being with you scares me more." She laughed softly, the sound warming him more than the fire. "That might be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "Not much good with fancy words," Zach warned. "Just plain truth." "Plain truth is all I've ever wanted," Grace said, leaning forward to press another gentle kiss to his lips. "From the beginning." They sat together by the fire, talking quietly about everything and nothing: the pageant preparations, ranch business, Martha's children, plans for the new year. As the evening grew late, Zach reluctantly prepared to leave, conscious of propriety and Martha's admonition. At the door, he kissed Grace once more, allowing himself to linger in the sweetness of the moment. "See you tomorrow," he said, "for the pageant." "Don't forget your costume," Grace reminded him with a teasing smile. "A wise man must look the part." "Just a robe and a crown," Zach grumbled good-naturedly. "Nothing fancy." "You'll be magnificent," Grace assured him, touching his cheek gently. "The most authentic wise man Wichita has ever seen." As Zach rode home through the clear, cold night, stars blazing overhead and the memory of Grace's kiss warm on his lips, he felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. The walls he'd built around his heart, brick by painful brick, were crumbling, and in their place, something new was being constructed, something stronger, more resilient, more alive. Christmas Eve dawned bright and cold, the recent snow glistening under a brilliant sun. The churchyard had been transformed overnight, with the wooden stable now adorned with fresh pine boughs. Lanterns hung from posts to illuminate the evening pageant, and a tall star constructed of wood and gold paper mounted above the scene. Zach arrived early as promised to help with final preparations. He found Grace in the church vestry, organizing costumes for the children with Martha's assistance. "Zach, perfect timing," Grace called, holding up a rich purple robe. "Your costume is ready." And look what Martha found for the wise men's gifts. Martha displayed 3 ornate boxes, clearly borrowed from someone's fine home. "Judge Patterson's wife loaned them," she explained, "said they were from her grandmother's collection." Zach eyed the purple robe with skepticism. "Seems." "Elaborate." "It's only for an hour," Grace reminded him, her eyes dancing with amusement. "And it's Christmas Eve. A little elaboration is appropriate." As the afternoon progressed, the church and yard filled with townspeople gathering for the special service and pageant. Children in costume darted about excitedly, their parents attempting to maintain some semblance of order. The lamb designated for the manger scene bleated plaintively from its temporary pen. In the church study, now serving as the men's changing area, Zach donned his costume with as much dignity as he could muster. The purple robe was surprisingly heavy, the crown a bit too large for his head despite Martha's adjustments. Looking in the small mirror, he barely recognized himself. "Most convincing wise man I've ever seen," said Pastor Williams, entering in his ceremonial robes. "Miss Owens will be pleased." "Feel ridiculous," Zach muttered. "Christmas pageants aren't about dignity, my friend," the pastor said with a chuckle. "They're about joy. About becoming like children ourselves for one night, seeing the wonder through their eyes." Put that way, Zach found his resistance weakening. If his participation brought joy to the Henderson children, to Grace, to this community that had somehow become important to him, then perhaps a temporary sacrifice of dignity was worthwhile. As dusk fell and lanterns were lit around the churchyard, the congregation gathered for the Christmas Eve service. Inside the packed church, Grace played the organ while the choir sang carols, their voices rising to the rafters in celebration. Scripture readings told the Christmas story, building anticipation for the living nativity to follow. From his position at the side entrance, waiting for his cue, Zach could see Grace at the organ, her face illuminated by candlelight, her expression one of pure joy as she played. Watching her, he felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. This woman, with her courage and her kindness, her music and her laughter, had awakened parts of him he'd thought long dead. She had seen past his defenses, his gruffness, his carefully maintained isolation. To the man he could be the man he perhaps had always been, beneath the layers of loss and grief. When the service concluded and the congregation moved outside for the living nativity, Zach took his place with the other wise men, the blacksmith and the banker, also in elaborate robes. Across the churchyard, he could see Mary and Joseph positioned by the manger, with shepherds and angels gathered nearby. The pageant began with Grace's clear voice narrating the Christmas story while the choir sang softly in the background. When the cue came for the wise men to approach, following the star, Zach stepped forward with more confidence than he'd expected to feel. As he crossed the churchyard, aware of the watching crowd, he found his eyes drawn not to the nativity scene but to Grace, standing to one side with her narrative script. She was watching him with such pride, such evident love, that everything else, his discomfort, his self-consciousness, faded away. Reaching the manger, Zach presented his gift with a bow more graceful than anyone who knew him might have expected. The congregation applauded, children called out excitedly, and for a moment, the Christmas story came alive in the cold Kansas night. When the pageant concluded, the community gathered in the church hall for refreshments and celebration. Children ran about excitedly, adults exchanged gifts and good wishes, and the spirit of the holiday infused the gathering with warmth despite the winter chill outside. Zach, having gladly exchanged his costume for his normal attire, stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Grace move among the townspeople. She seemed to belong everywhere, helping serve punch to the children, complimenting the choir members on their performance, accepting congratulations on the successful pageant with gracious modesty. When she finally made her way to his side, her face was flushed with happiness. "You were perfect," she said, taking his hand discreetly. "The most dignified wise man in pageant history. Glad it's over," Zach admitted, "but it wasn't as bad as I expected." Grace laughed. "High praise indeed. Perhaps next year you'll volunteer without coercion. Let's not get carried away." She squeezed his hand, her expression softening. Thank you for doing this, for being part of it all. It meant a great deal to me." Before Zach could respond, Martha approached with Eliza in tow, the child still wearing her angel wings despite having changed out of the rest of her costume. "Grace, dear, we should be heading home. The little ones are fading fast, and tomorrow will be an early morning with presents." She smiled at Zach. "Will you be joining us for Christmas dinner, Zachariah?" Zach glanced at Grace, whose eyes held clear invitation. "If that would be welcome." "Of course it would," Martha said firmly. 2 o'clock, same as Thanksgiving, and bring Miguel. No one should be alone on Christmas." As Martha gathered the rest of her brood, Eliza tugged at Zach's sleeve. "Mr. Mills, did you really see the baby Jesus in the manger?" Zach knelt to the child's level, mindful of her wings. "I surely did, Miss Eliza. Came a long way following that star." Eliza nodded solemnly. "And you brought him a present, gold," Zach confirmed. "For a king." "I think," Eliza said confidentially, "that you're the nicest wise man ever. Even if you don't smile much." Above them, Grace failed to suppress a laugh. Zach looked up at her, then back at the earnest child. "Tell you a secret, Miss Eliza." The girl nodded eagerly. "Been smiling more lately. Ask Miss Grace." Eliza's eyes widened. "Really? Why?" Zach rose, his eyes meeting Grace's over the child's head. "Found something worth smiling about." The simple statement, delivered in his straightforward manner, brought a blush to Grace's cheeks and a softness to her eyes that spoke volumes. As the Henderson family prepared to depart, Zach walked with Grace to their wagon. In the relative privacy of the churchyard's shadows, he took both her hands in his. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Zach." She gazed up at him, her face illuminated by starlight and distant lanterns. "The first of many, I hope." The implication of future together, Christmases stretching before them, might once have terrified him. Now it felt like promise rather than threat. "First of many," he agreed, sealing the words with a gentle kiss. As he watched the wagon depart, Zach realized he was, indeed, smiling. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was looking forward to tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. Christmas Day brought the promise of new beginnings. Zach and Miguel arrived at the Henderson farm promptly at 2 o'clock, both wearing their Sunday best and bearing gifts, toys Zach had carved for each of the children, and a pine-scented wreath Miguel had crafted for Martha. The house was filled with warmth and the smells of holiday cooking. The children greeted them exuberantly, eager to show off their Christmas treasures and to open the packages Zach had brought. Their delight in his simple carvings, a horse for Daniel, a bird for Sarah, a rabbit for Eliza, and appropriate gifts for the younger two, brought unexpected pleasure. But it was Grace's gift that held the greatest significance. In the relative privacy of the parlor, while Martha supervised the children with their new toys, Zach presented her with a small, carefully wrapped package. "Another gift?" Grace asked, surprised. "The carving was more than enough." "This is different," Zach said. "Something I've had for a while." Curious, Grace unwrapped the package to reveal a small leather pouch. Inside was a brooch, silver filigree surrounding a single pearl, elegant in its simplicity. "It was my mother's," Zach explained quietly. "Only thing of hers I managed to keep. Been in a drawer all these years." Grace's eyes widened as she understood the significance of what he was offering, not just a piece of jewelry, but a connection to his past, his family, his heart. "Zach," she whispered, "I can't possibly want you to have it," he interrupted gently. "She would have liked you, your spirit, your music." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes as she looked from the brooch to his face. "I'm honored, truly. I'll treasure it always." She carefully pinned the brooch to her dress, her fingers lingering on the pearl. "How does it look?" "Like it was made for you," Zach said honestly. Grace impulsively reached up to kiss him, a brief but tender gesture. "Thank you for sharing this piece of your past with me. Thinking more about the future these days," Zach admitted. The afternoon and evening passed in a haze of good food, laughter, and the simple joy of being among people who genuinely cared for one another. Zach found himself drawn into games with the children, conversations with Martha about spring planting, and quiet moments with Grace by the fire. As night fell and preparations were made for departure, Zach found himself reluctant to leave. The Henderson home had become a place of belonging, largely because of Grace's presence within it. "Walk with me to the barn," he asked as Grace helped him into his coat. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the winter sky. Lantern in hand, they walked slowly toward the barn where Zach's horses waited. "Been thinking," Zach said, breaking a comfortable silence. "About what you said. That I've convinced myself I prefer solitude when what I really fear is loss." Grace glanced up at him, her expression attentive but not pressing. "You were right," he continued. "Built walls after losing my family, built them higher after the war. Thought if I didn't let anyone close, couldn't lose them. A natural response to pain," Grace said softly, "maybe, but a lonely one." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Don't want to be lonely anymore, Grace." She set the lantern on a nearby fence post, its glow creating a small circle of light around them. "What do you want, Zach?" It was the most direct question she'd asked him, and it deserved an equally direct answer. "You," he said simply. "A life with you if you'll have me." Grace's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. Is this?" "Not doing this properly," Zach acknowledged, reaching for her hands. "Should have a ring, should be on one knee probably." "No," Grace said quickly. "This is perfect, just as it is, just as you are." Zach took a breath, gathering courage. "Grace Owens, will you marry me?" Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Zachariah Mills." Relief and joy flooded through him, emotions so long dormant he scarcely recognized them. He pulled her closer, kissing her with all the feeling he couldn't put into words. When they finally parted, Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You know," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "when I first met you, everyone in town warned me about the reclusive Mr. Mills who turned away every kindness. They said you were cold, unreachable." "Wasn't far wrong," Zach admitted. Grace shook her head, reaching up to touch his face gently. "No, they were entirely wrong. You weren't cold, you were protecting a heart that had known too much pain. You weren't unreachable, you were waiting for someone who wouldn't give up at the first rebuff." Her insight humbled him. "You saw through me from the start." "I recognized something in you," Grace corrected. "A kind of loneliness I understood too well. And I remember thinking, that day at the fair when you defended me against Tucker, that beneath all that stoicism was a man who deserved to be loved. Who needed to be loved, whether he realized it or not." "You deserve to be loved anyway," she said softly, echoing words she'd spoken to him once before. "Not because of what you do or what you provide, but simply because of who you are." Zach had spent decades believing he neither needed nor wanted love, that independence and solitude were preferable to the vulnerability of emotional attachment. But standing in the cold Kansas night, with Grace's words washing over him like healing rain, he finally understood the truth. Everyone deserved to be loved, even him, especially him. "Don't have much to offer," he said roughly, "just a ranch. A life that's not always easy." Grace's smile was luminous. "You're offering yourself, Zach. That's everything I want." As they walked back to the house to share their news with Martha and the children, Zach felt lighter than he had in years, decades, perhaps. The burden of isolation, of self-imposed emotional exile, had lifted, replaced by something he had nearly forgotten how to recognize: hope. Spring came early to Kansas that year, painting the prairie with wildflowers and fresh green growth. The April wedding of Zachariah Mills and Grace Owens was the social event of the season in Wichita, drawing attendees from miles around, curious to witness the union of the once reclusive rancher and the talented music teacher from Philadelphia. The ceremony, held in the same church where they had grown to know each other through choir practices and Christmas pageants, was simple but meaningful. Martha's children participated enthusiastically, Daniel as ring bearer, despite his still healing arm, Sarah and Eliza strewing flower petals before the bride. Grace wore a gown of ivory satin, elegant but not ostentatious, with her mother's veil and Zach's mother's brooch her only adornments. As she walked down the aisle toward him, Zach felt a sense of wonder that this remarkable woman had chosen him, had seen past his defenses to the man he could be. Their vows were straightforward, spoken clearly and with conviction. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Zach kissed his bride before the assembled congregation, the applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. The celebration afterward, held at the Mills Ranch, transformed the usually quiet property into a scene of festivity. Lanterns hung from trees, tables groaned with food contributed by every family in the community, and a small band provided music for dancing under the spring sky. As dusk fell and the party continued around them, Zach led Grace away from the gathering, toward a hill overlooking the property. "Want to show you something," he said, taking her hand. At the top of the rise stood a structure covered with canvas. Zach removed the covering to reveal a piano not new but lovingly restored, its wood polished to a warm glow. "Zach," Grace gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Where did you?" "Found it in Junction City. Man there was selling his late wife's things." Zach ran his hand over the instrument's smooth surface. "Miguel helped me bring it home last week. Had it tuned yesterday." Grace approached the piano with reverence, lifting the cover to reveal the keys. "It's beautiful," she whispered. She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears. "But why is it here, not in the house?" "Because this," Zach said, gesturing to the hilltop, "is where the new house will stand, breaking ground next week." Grace looked around, taking in the view of the ranch below, the rolling prairie beyond. "A new house," Zach nodded. "Cabin's too small for a family. Thought we'd build something proper, with a music room facing east to catch the morning light." "A family," Grace repeated softly, her hand unconsciously moving to rest against her stomach. "Zach, there's something I need to tell you." Zach looked at her closely, noting the glow in her cheeks, the secret smile playing at her lips. Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you?" She nodded, her smile widening. "I suspected for a few weeks, but the doctor confirmed it yesterday. We'll have a child by Christmas." Joy, pure and overwhelming, surged through Zach. He gathered Grace into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an uncharacteristic display of exuberance. "Careful," she laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "I'm in a delicate condition, or so Martha keeps reminding me." Zach set her down gently, his hands remaining at her waist. "A baby," he said wonderingly, "our baby." "Are you happy?" Grace asked, searching his face. "More than I thought possible," Zach answered honestly. "More than I deserve." Grace shook her head firmly. "There you go again, thinking you don't deserve happiness." "When will you believe me, Zachariah Mills? You deserve every joy this life has to offer." Zach pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Starting to believe it," he admitted, "with your help." As they stood together on the hill that would soon hold their new home, with the sounds of celebration floating up from below and the promise of new life growing between them. Zach marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had spent so many years alone, convinced that solitude was safer than connection, that independence was preferable to vulnerability. It had taken this remarkable woman, with her music and her courage and her unwavering belief in his worth, to show him the truth. Love wasn't a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be embraced. Family wasn't just something to be lost, but something to be built, nurtured, celebrated. And the heart, once opened, had a capacity for joy far greater than the pain it feared. "I love you, Grace Mills," he said, the words coming easily now, naturally like breathing. "And I love you," she replied, her eyes reflecting the first stars appearing in the twilight sky. "Always." Below them, the lanterns of their wedding celebration glowed like earthbound stars, illuminating the gathering of friends and neighbors who had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved companions. Before them stretched a future bright with promise, a new home, a growing family, a life built on music and honesty and hard-won joy. Zachariah Mills, who had once refused every kindness, every overture of friendship or love, now stood embracing all that he had previously denied himself. And in the gentle evening breeze, he could almost hear his mother's voice approving, rejoicing. "You deserve to be loved anyway." And finally, completely, he believed it was true.